Hi everybody, this is Allison. My goal here is to introduce you to taxonomy in general with an emphasis on plant taxonomy. I'm going to do that by first defining the term and then talking about the need to classify and name species. We'll talk a little bit about one scheme of classification, which is known as the biological hierarchy, which you're probably already pretty familiar with. We'll talk a little bit about the naming conventions for all life forms and then some things that are specific to plants. And then finally, we'll end by talking about some exciting taxonomic controversies. Okay, so taxonomy might not sound that exciting. It is the science of naming and classifying species. So it's kind of like the Dewey Decimal System for biologists. It's a way to try to organize our understanding of species, organize and then give them a name so that we can clearly communicate about these life forms. This is necessary because there are so many species out there. So there are over 1.4 million described species. This pie graph shows the breakdown of those species. So over half of them are insects, amazingly. About 250,000 of them are plants. But we know that the 1.4 million that we've described is a drop in the bucket. There's way more diversity that's out there that we haven't described yet. So Mora and his colleagues in 2011 predicted, based on their analysis, that there are probably more like 8.7 million just eukaryotes on Earth. So the reason why we need taxonomy is because there's a lot of life forms out there and it's an active field. There's still many, many organisms out there that we need to get to know and we need to classify and we need to name. And indeed, thousands of species are described every year. So, um, taxonomy is the name of the modern discipline. So those are the taxonomists are the people who name and classify life forms. But this is a really ancient practice. So people have always felt the need to try to name and organize or classify the life forms that they were surrounded by. And that's because organisms have always been important to humans in their survival. So this goes back to Aristotle. This is a picture of a publication by Pliny the Elder, who was a ancient natural historian. In some cases, we needed and still do need taxonomy for practical purposes. For example, publications such as this from Pliny the Elder were useful in trying to describe which life forms are out there that were edible to people, harmful, medicinal, potentially good for cultivation or domestication. So there are practical reasons why we need taxonomy, and we have for hundreds of thousands of years. Um, and there are also important scientific reasons why it's important for us to organize this information and to have a clear, consistent system of naming life forms. So speaking of a clear system of naming life forms, I wanted to show you a really convoluted name for this plant, Plantago media. So that's what we call it now. Back in the 1700s, it was called this, Plantago folius ovado lanceolatus pubescentibus spica cylindrica scapo tereti, which kind of translates into plantain with pubescent ovate lanceolate leaves, a cylindric spike, and a terete scape. So this is really cumbersome, and this is how we were communicating about plants um, in the 1700s. Now, what I have here, Plantagomedia, is the standard. This is called its Latin binomial. So this was an effort to try to standardize the way we name organisms and also an effort to just kind of streamline and simplify the naming. And this unified and simple system was the product of the work of Carl Linnaeus. And so this was occurring in the 18th century. Um, and the reason why during this time period the need arose was because um, people began to travel a little bit more widely on steamships. And there were natural historians in Europe who were making collections in Europe. There were collections being made in other places around the world, in Asia and North America. But then they couldn't talk about the species if they didn't have a consistent way of naming them. So Carl Linnaeus, kind of the father of taxonomy. He's the one who set us on our current trajectory of using these simple names, and he also came up with a method of organization that we'll talk about in just a minute. So the two-part name that we just looked at for the plantain, Plantagomedia, is called the Latin binomial, or sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the scientific name of the organism. Another example would be the Latin binomial Pinus ponderosa. Both of these words are Latinized, so they're not real Latin words in many cases. Um, Linnaeus chose Latin. He chose to Latinize the words because that was sort of a common language, an intellectual language that was being used um, by by natural historians that would have been all around the world at that point. He was Swedish, and I guess he thought that Swedish wasn't the best option, so he went with Latin. The binomial includes the genus, which for Pinus ponderosa would be Pinus, and that needs to be capitalized. And then the second part of the binomial is what's called the specific epithet. When you write these in print, they should be underlined. When you type them, they can either be underlined or they should be in italics, like this one is here. So the genus refers to a more inclusive group. So for Pinus ponderosa, the genus Pinus includes all of the pines. But when you put these two words together, it just refers to the one species, the ponderosa pine. You can use the genus on its own, Pinus, but you can't use the specific epithet on its own. Ponderosa doesn't signify the species together. Pinus ponderosa does. In some cases, you'll see that the scientific name is followed by a variety or a subspecies. These are taxonomic groupings that are below the species level. So it's a way that you could distinguish between different kinds of Pinus ponderosa. And you can see that here, written here for Juniperus occidentalis. That's an example of a plant where we've identified different varieties, and those are used when there's obvious differences between populations or somewhere within the species. Okay, so Linnaeus gave us the Latin binomial, or the scientific name, but there are also other names for these organisms that are commonly used. So those are called common names. These are not standardized for plants. So I went to the Jepson's manual, and that's what all this text is. Don't worry about memorizing or even reading through all this. This is crazy. These are all of the different common names that are in use for this one species. Here's the scientific name, Sorbus scapulina. Um, so you might call this plant the Greens Mountain ash. You might call it the Rocky Mountain ash. Some people might refer to it as the Cascade Mountain ash. Some people might refer to it as the Dwarf Rocky Mountain ash. Um, and this is really confusing. So common names tend to vary a lot by region. And this is one reason why in some cases they're inferior to the scientific name. They're superior in the sense that a lot of people don't know the scientific name, so they can help us communicate important information about the species, but it can be confusing. There's a couple of other notes about the presentation of the common name. They should not be capitalized unless there's a proper noun in here, like green, so that's somebody's name, or Rocky Mountain. Um, but in general, if there's no proper nouns in them, they shouldn't be capitalized. You'll also sometimes see hyphens within a common name, like you can see right here, so actually says Rock Mountain Dash Ash. So that hyphen indicates that this plant is actually not even an ash. And so that's another really confusing thing about common names. The ash plants are in the genus Fraxinus, so it's a plant that has compound leaves like this mountain ash, but the fact that we're using the term ash at all in the common name is pretty confusing. So, these common names have their place, but they can be a little bit tricky. Okay, so I mentioned that Linnaeus was responsible for unifying the naming of plants by giving us this Latin binomial, and he also gave us a system of organizing organisms. And what I have here, this diagram is kind of the modern version of Linnaean's biological hierarchy, where all of life first gets divided into domains, and there's 3 of those. Then the domains get divided into kingdoms, and each of the kingdoms gets divided into phylums. Each of the phylums gets divided into classes. The classes get further divided into orders, and then you go to family, genus, and then finally um, you're at the species level. So Linnaeus ranked species into ever more inclusive categories based on shared characteristics. So I'll give you an example of that for a plant. This is the plant with the Latin binomial Allium cepa. You are probably really familiar with this plant because it's a common vegetable. So this is the onion. And I don't have the domain on here, but the onion would be in the domain Eukarya. And so that's the huge group of life forms that all have eukaryotic cells. Within the domain Eukarya, the onion would be in the plant kingdom. So the animals and the fungi would be together in the domain, the more inclusive group, but only the plants are going to be inside this smaller subgroup. Within the plant kingdom, the onion's going to be in the phylum Magnoliophyta, and that's the phylum where all of the flowering plants are. So the onion is going to be lumped in with the violets and all of these other plants, not the pines. So the pines would be in the phylum Coniferophyta, so they'd be in the same kingdom, but they're in a different phylum. The onion is going to, if we drill down a little bit deeper, we get to the class Liliopsida, and that is pretty much all of the monocots. Those are, so we're getting more and more specific as we drill down and eventually get down to the species level. So the monocots are the plants that usually have flower parts in multiples of 3 or 6. They usually have linear leaves with parallel leaf venation, although not always. Um, and we keep on drilling down further and further and further. The genus Allium here is going to include, monocots that tend to have kind of stinky leaves and bulbs, like the onions and the shallots and garlic. And then finally, we're going to get down to the most specific and the least inclusive level in the hierarchy. That would be Allium cepa. So this is just an example of how that hierarchy works for a specific plant species. It just gets more and more specific as you drill down. And as you go up, the onion's going to be lumped into groups with more and more organisms. Okay, so this is actually a really active area of research. Taxonomy is a really active area of research um, for plants and for a whole bunch of different groups. And it may not sound like it would be controversial or it would be exciting, but it really is. And part of the reason why this is changing so much is because we're getting more and more information about life. So Linnaeus placed organisms into these subgroups of the hierarchy based on their shared physical traits. Then, in 1859, Charles Darwin changed biology by publishing The Origin of Species and articulating his understanding of evolution. So then, the evolutionary history of organisms became an important part of their classification. So not only do we want to lump organisms based on who shares physical traits, but we would hope that those traits are actually traits that are shared because the organisms have a shared evolutionary history. So that caused some reshuffling of the groups to emphasize the evolutionary history rather than just the physical characteristics. Because physical characteristics can lead you astray sometimes. For example, within the animal kingdom, bats and birds and insects all have wings. So they all have similar characteristics, but they did not inherit those characteristics from a common ancestor. So if we were to lump them together in one closely related group based on the fact that they have wings, we would create a group based on shared physical traits, but it would not reflect their evolutionary history. The insects should go in with the other arthropods. The bats should go in with the mammals, um, and the birds should go in with the reptiles. Today, we've thrown another wrench in the works by developing DNA and protein sequencing technologies, and these are also used to try to distinguish um, who's more closely related to who. So that's another tool that we now have for trying to strengthen our understanding of evolutionary relationships. So this has led to so many changes in the naming and the organization of life forms. And I just want to give you one example. You don't need to memorize the information in this chart. I just put it down here to show you how much things have changed. So when Linnaeus came up with this idea, he said that there were two kingdoms, the vegetabilia or the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom, and he put all life forms in either one of those two kingdoms. Um, but as you can see, as we've learned more through the years, that system has really changed. And I want to give you an example of how some specific evidence has changed our classification by looking at the Monera kingdom. So we can see that pop up here and here in the 30s and then again in the 60s. Monera was a kingdom that included all the prokaryotes. And you can see why that would happen based on shared physical traits. So they all look similar. They're all really simple. They're single-celled organisms. They don't have nuclei. But now we've got molecular data on the Monera, many organisms within this former kingdom. And now we know that some of them are way more closely related to eukaryotes than others. So we've changed our system and we've developed the bacteria and the archaean domain based on this new understanding. So I want to give you some tools for trying to navigate some of this controversy because the two books that we use in this class are getting a little bit old. So one of them was published, I believe, in early 2000s, the Woody Plant book, and then the Wildflowers book was published back in the 70s. So as you can see by looking at this table, a lot has changed in taxonomy since these books were published. So you can navigate this controversy. You can navigate the controversy by going to the Jepson Online Interchange. And this is the website for the Jepson Online Interchange. You can also Google it and click on the link. So this is a resource that's been put together by the UC Jepson Herbarium at Berkeley. And when you click on the link, you'll come to a page that looks like this. Right here, you can type in a scientific name. So let's say you just used our Trees and Shrubs book to key out a plant. It gave you a name, and let's say the name was Chrysothamnus facidiflorus. So you would type that name into this box and then you would click submit. And then it would take you to a page with a whole bunch of information about that particular plant. It would tell you the family that it's in here. And then here is where you need to look to figure out if the name has changed. The current status for Chrysothamnus facidiflorus says that it's an accepted name for taxon native to California. So that's great. That means that the name hasn't changed and you can use that name and people all over the world will understand what you mean. Well, I think I should say botanists all over the world will understand what you mean. I want to point out that there's also a ton of other information um, on this website about the plant. So you can look at Cal photo images for the plant. You can look up the common names. That's where I got that list for the plantain that I showed you earlier. Um, you can also look up specific herbarium records. This is really powerful when you found a plant, you looked it up, you keyed it out to this particular species, you can kind of check your work by going and looking through these specimen records because sometimes somebody else will have collected another plant at that exact same location. So that's a good verification that you're probably on the right track. You can also look at the county distribution map of their specimens, so that can help you figure out if you're on the right track. If you look at the county distribution and the only specimens that they found are from San Diego County, in other counties down south, you're probably not on the right track if you ID'd it up in Siskiyou County. Okay, so let's say you went to the Jepson's Online Interchange and you were trying to look up a flower. So you used our Wildflowers book and you keyed out a plant to Arabis sparsiflora in that book. So you would type in the scientific name in this box, you would hit submit, and then this page would come up. So Arabis sparsiflora, it tells us the family name once again, but we have a problem here. So it says current status, taxonomic or naming nomenclature synonym for a taxon native to California. Current name, Bochara sparsiflora. So this is an example of a plant that's been placed into a different species, or I'm sorry, been placed into a different genus. So this is the name that you should use for this plant rather than Arabis sparsiflora. And once again, you've got all this great information down here through the Jepson's Online Interchange about any plant that you look up. So this is one way that we can kind of navigate some of these controversies, and we can also get updated taxonomic information about plants, get the most up-to-date taxonomic information about the flora of California. Okay, so to conclude, I hope that this lecture helped you learn what taxonomy is, so it's the naming and the classifying of species. And I hope it also helps you understand why naming and classifying is useful. I also hope that you're familiar with the levels of the biological hierarchy: domain, kingdom, phylum, order, class, family, genus, species. There's a bunch of mnemonics out there that you can use to help you remember the different levels. You should also be familiar with the structure of the Latin binomial, as well as some of the characteristics of common names that we talked about. And you should be able to explain why there are taxonomic controversies, because we have more information about these organisms, more evolutionary information and molecular information about these organisms. The groupings are in flux. And finally, you should know how you can find the most up-to-date information about the classification of California plants. I recommend that you use the Jepson's online interchange. Okay, let me know if you have any questions about this, and thank you for listening.